Ladies and gentlemen, you may have noticed there was no one for me to talk to when Patricia asked, talk to somebody near you about your fear of failure. So I'm going to tell all of you. My fear of failure, which is extremely well-founded, is to come after the last two speakers. Who put a computer scientist futurologist together with a researcher and brilliant entrepreneur with a bank chairman? I have no idea, and it must reflect badly on me that I've actually stood up to talk. But what I want to do in the 14.27 seconds left to talk to you is I don't want to use slides. I want to go back a little bit and tell you a couple of stories and rise above, just because I know nothing really of the wonderful things that have been mentioned, and talk basically about our nation and indeed the fear of failure within it. Let me firstly take you, occasionally, I'm lucky enough to go walking in Europe, and many people do in Australia have that luck. This time I walked with 5 people from Silicon Valley. I'd never met them before. It was a matter of happenchance. It was clear to me that one of them was the leader of the pack. Everybody talked about this person. Everybody clearly thought that he was something. So, of course, with a mixture of Google, which was quite hard at the top of the Dolomites, but I tried, but also talking to the others, it became clear that he was a billionaire from Silicon Valley. And so I thought, naturally, being a banker, I'm going to get to know this fellow. So we walked and we talked for 4 days. And what came out of it was that he was a humble, incredibly intelligent man who had thought of an idea, which I won't go into because you'll be able to Google and find out who he was. And what made him humble was that he told me in the early 2000s, in the tech boom, he lost everything. He lost his home, he lost his car, which I don't think was a Tesla in those days, and so on. I reflected, and I want you to reflect, on whether in Australia a person could tumble mightily, as he did, and come back 14, 15 years later to be a billionaire again and on top of the pile. It can happen occasionally, but it is unlikely. And I want to put to you that we have institutionalized, in my opinion, a fear of failure. It's interesting, Ramez says we fear change. I would like to add to that, if I may. I don't think we fear change when we're certain it's good for us. We fear change because we think we might fail or it might affect what we're doing, which means we would fail. And it seems to me that in Australia, if you look at our laws, and I'm sorry, I'm a lawyer from old, if you, for example, operate a company in an insolvent state, not only do we say you're naughty, but we put you in jail. If you happen to be a director of a company which basically operates that way, you have the same problems. We don't have what the Americans call safe harbors, where if you've acted properly, you can escape liability and go on to have lovely holidays in Europe and become millionaires, etc., in the tech industry. I put to you that this is an indication of the way we think. It comes from the European, in my opinion, UK case law, where you are bad if you fail. And I would put to you this is out of date. And I want to say, Bill Ferris, who is indeed an old friend, has done more, in my opinion, in the last year for this cause than anyone I know. And all I can say is I hope the wind is behind your sails and that the laws do change and change quickly. Because as a nation, it is, in my opinion, quite explicable that people will not take chances when the fear of failure is, in fact, at times very real. The second thing I would say is I don't know how many of you either aspire to or are clever enough not to aspire to be on boards of companies. But let me tell you, there are queues a mile long for the established companies. And Ramez may say that might be a dangerous thing because there may be change. But the ones that no one really queues for are the little ones. And the reason one doesn't queue for that is exactly what I've just talked about. That people in Australia fear what could happen, and it is there enshrined in our law. I wanted to, seeing I don't have big things on the board, tell you a second story. I'm lucky enough to be the Chancellor of a wonderful university, which I'll revert to in a second in view of what Ramesh said a little while ago. At my university, we have a whole lot of scientists, but a scientist recently invited me into his lair or his den and said to me he is sweating on some outside valuation, vindication or whatever of a hypothesis that he's been working on for 8 years. Naively, I am a bank chairman, I said to him, "You must be very worried." He said, "Not particularly worried." I said, "Why aren't you worried? If the hypothesis is wrong, you've wasted 8 years' work." To which he said to me, sobering as it was, "No, in science, I don't fail if my hypothesis fails, because what I've contributed to science is basically that was the wrong hypothesis." And it occurred to me, why don't we think of that more generally in the way we live our lives? That we can contribute through success, but we can also contribute through failure. Because our failure, provided it hasn't diddled people and has been done ethically correctly, demonstrates how something can't be done, or that the consumers of 2016 weren't ready for it. Maybe they will be in 2020. So I put to you, from these two stories, that basically we need a rethink in Australia. That a fear of failure, fine, but it is not the end of the road. And I believe once we think that way, our fear will be much more contained. Now, I wanted to be constructive, believe it or not, chairs of banks do want to be constructive, and give you a few ideas of what I believe as a nation we have to do to get ourselves going in this time of need for innovation. I've already mentioned changing the laws, and bless Bill, let's hope he gets that done. But the second thing I'd like to put to you is that we think in Australia far too short term. And by the way, I know why we do that. We do it because most of the people who invest in us also think short term. And they look, as I do, I've got to be honest, at their iPhone and iPad, at our shares every day, and if they go down, that's bad. Having said that, what is a day in many, many years? In my travels in Asia, and I do a lot of travelling in Asia, the key thing they have up on us, and I might say I saw some of it in Silicon Valley, although sometimes they're a bit short thinking there too, is that they think long term. That indeed they're thinking about achieving things, if it's the Chinese, in a 5-year plan. In other parts of Asia, even longer. I have to put it to you, if we want to prevent failure, we have to start to increase our horizons. And that, by the way, is going to mean we're going to have to retool ourselves. Instead of just explaining the short term, we're going to have to explain where we're going, how we're getting there. And many of us fear that because we fear someone will copy us or try and stop us. And we have to elevate ourselves to think the longer term. The second thing I think we need to do is to start to look outside our sectors, which is why, Bill, I didn't want to answer your question. I feel very strongly that most of us live in a world which we are comfortable in and don't stray out of it. There are notable exceptions, and I'm sure there are many in this room. But take myself. Throughout my many, many years of work, I've mainly been a business person, whether a service provider or a person actually in it. I've loved the idea of not-for-profits, of academia. I haven't loved the idea of politics, but I've noted it. The fact of the matter is that if you go to America, a good CV is only made if you've moved between the sectors. How can we reduce our fear of failure unless we understand much more robustly what's going on? And we have perhaps more contacts, more ideas and so on coming from a much broader source. I would put to you in Australia, we've actively got to try and encourage people to move from sector to sector, to hold hands within the sector. And this comes back very squarely to the question of the academics and those of us in business. My perception is both sides of that equation really relate to each other. But the way we look at each other is they're there and we're here. And if we could be more like the Americans in this one instance, I might say, it would be wonderful that a good business person goes off into academia, does a bit of research, teaches, and so on, and then mixes with academics, comes back, and so on. And the same with those who are the leading academics. I want to put to you, if I may also, and Bill mentioned my obvious involvement in education. I believe that education in Australia is fundamental. And it's not just for what we've pushed, which is obviously needs-based funding to allow the disadvantaged in educational terms to rise up. I believe that strongly. But I also believe we need to educate so that people understand a lot more that's going on practically around them. For example, what is risk? Many people I know fear risk. I fear not understanding risk. Most risks, for example, crossing a road, are things that we can assess ourselves. I don't know what happens with driverless cars, but I assume they will stop. We know that we have to get across the road and make that decision. On the other hand, walking between two buildings, certainly for me on a tightrope, would be too much. But it's my assessment of what I'm capable of and indeed what risk I wish to take. We need to educate people to think about that. And finally, I want to just say to you in relation to education, I have watched with glee that people like the university I'm with and many others that are here in Australia are moving in three ways which are fundamental. Firstly, they are authorising the use of their patents for no consideration. And I think that's wonderful. And certainly my university does it where we're not able to actually use them ourselves. The second thing is they are educating people to do things that are the new jobs in society. And if I may just say a little bit of a third story, I graduated 75 people recently in journalism. And you've got to say something as they come across the stage. So I asked them, they're smiling, have you got a job? And basically I thought that would make them quite worried. All of them had jobs, and we all know that there are very few journalism positions available. All of them had jobs in data collection. When I went to university 200 years ago, there was no data collection. My point is we have to educate that there are plenty of jobs coming, but they're different jobs. And that the old jobs, and I agree with that quote that we saw earlier, may be under threat, but the new jobs are there for the taking. And finally, I wanted to say, I believe that all of us should look, in my opinion, optimistically as a whole of what we're looking forward to. And that means not being siloed, and that means looking long term, and that means, in my opinion, suffering those nicely who have failed because they've contributed to us what is failure and indeed should be allowed, if they're proper and haven't broken the law, to actually rise again.